All right, it is the top of the hour, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining Network Partners for our Brunch and Learn web event, Labeling Process Assessment, Good, Better, and Best with Chris Heckert. A few quick housekeeping items. We ask that you mute yourselves upon entry, so note that myself and a colleague will actively be monitoring and manually muting participants as needed. Next, please address all questions through the chat feature of the platform. If you scroll your mouse just a little bit, you're going to see a little chat bubble that says show conversation, and that is where you can enter in your questions. We'll be answering these questions at the very end of the presentation. And then lastly, this webinar is recorded, so you'll receive the recorded presentation as well as the PDF version of this PowerPoint deck that we'll go through today. So without further ado, Network Partners' Senior Director of Labeling, Chris Heckert.
Thank you very much, Renee. And I was about to tell everyone that my name is Chris Heckert, and I'm the Senior Director of Labeling Solutions at Network Partners. And I'm here to talk about assessing your labeling process. So why would anyone want to conduct a process assessment of your labeling? Because you have labeling issues, and it's incredibly worthwhile defining them so you can address them. If your label content doesn't run off the edge of your label when it prints in production and the label sticks to the carton, the majority of the people in your company will say you don't have labeling issues. If labeling issues do bubble up to management because the lack of a label is holding up a shipping or delaying getting product registered in a new market, the first response may be to add headcount because labeling has so many stakeholders. The simplest, least disruptive thing is to add a cook to the kitchen. But this solution isn't addressing any systemic problems. It's spreading the burden over more people. It's treating the symptom, not the disease. Here's how too many companies' labeling processes are currently operating. Label content is never complete when the label is needed. The development engineers who need the labels don't know they need to provide the label content for those labels. People who should provide the label content just wait for the labeling group to fill in the blanks for them. With all the different products and different acquisitions, only the labeling group understands what's needed for each label anyway. The labeling system is not the best, but if you know the ins and outs, you can bend the system to revise a label pretty quickly. Jennifer's on vacation, but she'll be able to get this label to print from the beach. Heck, last year she fixed 2 labels for me from the Badlands. And I'm thinking about leaving a little early today. I had to come in at 3:30 this morning because the label on the second line kept wrapping around the breaker plate again.
Hi, Chris Heckert.
Yes.
And Chris Bonifield. We're actually having trouble seeing the slides. I can currently see the title slide, but quite a few people within the chat have notified us that we are unable to see the slides. Do you mind turning off your screen and resharing?
Oh, I'm sorry, reshare. Yes, not a problem. I don't think we've advanced the slide yet. If the issue is no one's seen the slide advance, it's because it's just about to.
We were seeing a handful of us were seeing no slide.
Gotcha.
So everybody?
I can see it now.
Okay, great. I was going to say either in the chat feature or really quickly, just let us know. Okay, perfect. People can now see your slide. We're good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. In the background, people seem to have accepted that it takes 3 months to make a label. The labeling group accepts that they need to complete the label request form because no one else knows how to fill it out. And the reason it takes 3, 4, or 5 weeks to approve a change order to get a label created or revised is because everyone waits to approve the CO since everyone knows it's going to get rejected multiple times. All of this means that labeling is seen as a necessary but difficult and broken process. Engagement with labeling is required, but frustrating. There's little to celebrate about labeling. This is really too bad because a good labeling process is a beautiful thing to behold. A good labeling process can create or revise a label in a day. The inputs for label content are well defined and understood at the time of design freeze. The label content intake process is streamlined and is easy for the content providers to submit their information. The actual label creation or revision is done by a specialist, and when it is sent for approval, the label has already been confirmed to print in the production environment. This means that upon approval, the label ownership transfers to production, who is now responsible for print quality and putting the right label on the right product. In a good labeling process, a validated labeling system manages the label content in a way that ensures the data is stable. It has design tools that make creating formats easy. It has symbol, image, and phrase libraries for consistency. It makes side-by-side comparison of label changes easy. It supports reboxing and rework. A validated global labeling system manages, inside the system, country-specific labeling without the need for label content to be controlled with bills of material. It can print out IFUs at the time of shipping, and it can manage the approval and versioning of labels, IFUs, and carton artwork. It can easily scale to accommodate the label of an acquired company, and it can be accessed by your suppliers and contract manufacturers to ensure that they're only printing labels created and approved by you. It also becomes the cleanest master data in your company. Reports from the labeling system become the scoping instrument for quality issues. A good labeling process is perceived as a great asset that offers immediate solutions to any labeling requirement. Engaging with labeling is always a pleasant situation because everyone is so competent, they've got a great system, and it's surprising how much they know and can do. For the sake of this webinar, I'll be bending the definition of assessment. As a consultancy, we've conducted dozens of labeling process assessments, and we've come to see how these processes all fit a similar model, which makes sense because we're all aiming at the exact same target. On our first assessment, we started out counting the labels, quantifying how long it took to create or revise a label, defining the labeling system, how many quality events involving labeling the company experienced, and we asked the labeling stakeholders about their pain points. And that's what we reported. It was fine, but dealt with each issue individually. It wasn't really an attention getter. After a couple more assessments, we started to see a pattern, and our assessment reports got a lot more interesting as we started to identify the soft points in the process where the pain points were seen and what needed to be addressed to resolve those pain points. We were able to report on these issues not individually, but as parts of a whole. Our assessments became much more comprehensive and presented a logical path to remediation. For example, on one label process assessment, I'm also learning that process assessment is really hard to say over and over without making a mistake. We logged 54 pain points across 10 different stakeholder groups. It was a very engaged assessment, and we were able to trace those 54 pain points to 4 distinct areas. It turns out, with very few exceptions, that every assessment we've conducted shakes out along the same lines. This webinar then is not about how to count your label formats and count your field actions and figure out how long it takes to create a label. It's how to perform an assessment and compare it to a model of optimal labeling process. So here's the secret sauce. The assessment should be done with an understanding of how your current process stacks up to these 4 pillars of a solid labeling process. Label content is identified, roles and responsibilities are defined, standard procedures to create and print labels are defined, and there is a label system that can manage the label data in a way that benefits your business. So let's start with identifying your labeling content. Give your labeling policy a good shaking and see if that policy contains what your label content should be. Are you labeling to meet regulatory compliance? Are you labeling to support point of purchase sales? Are you labeling for healthcare professionals? Are you labeling for retail sales? No matter what you want your labeling to accomplish, you can define what elements you'll need to put on your label to meet that goal. If you do not have your label elements called out before you go to create your label, you'll have to figure this out for every label. You'll have to have the discussion on whether you should add latex-free to your titanium hip stem. You'll have a repeat discussion on whether you need to include USA or U.S.A to the manufacturer's address. If you haven't had this one yet, you'll soon have the discussion on whether to include the outer protective layer symbol on your sterile barrier label. Someone will suggest the warning symbol instead of the consult instructions for you symbol, and on and on. You all know what I'm talking about. It's a reimagination of the label every time a new group sits down. If I unmuted everyone, you'd all have a nightmare story to share about this exact situation. And someone would say after them, and then we had to revise every label we already had to add the zip +4 code. I'm smiling. I was in that meeting. If you're labeling to meet regulatory compliance requirements, for instance, then accumulate all the information that the FDA, CMDR, the EU MDR, and any other national laws and regulations of the markets you distribute in require. You'll end up with a list of requirements that include a product description, a catalog number, a manufacturer address, a device identifier, a production identifier, a UDI barcode with the DI and the PI. Based on your situation, you might need an expiration date, an attestment that the device is sterile and how it got that way, an MR safe warning, CE mark, a phthalate warning, etc. Once you identify what is required and conditionally required, write it down and have everyone sign it. Call it a policy, make it an appendix, make it a specification. Just make sure it's a controlled document. If someone wants to add a QR code or a tagline or to change the way the expiry date is represented, you just tell them that by policy, by specification, that you can't. Your label content is locked. You will not miss the label content meetings. Right behind needing to have the label elements identified, assess your process to make sure there is a group responsible for supplying each one of those label elements. Look to see that these responsibilities are clear and understood. But most importantly, make sure you've got a 1-to-1 ratio on this responsibility. That means only one group has the responsibility for each label element. Each element only has one owner. Every company is different. I can't tell you which group should be responsible for which elements, but if I were in charge and everybody had to do what I say, I would get all my required product information, my product description, catalog or part number, my shelf life if I have one, my method of sterilization if I have one, my temperature limitations if I have any storage handling requirements, my MR compatibility if necessary, etc. I'd get all those from development or R&D or whatever you call the department that owns the design history file for the product. I would get my brand name and company logo from marketing. I would get my trademark status pending or registered from legal. I'd get my G10 or other UDI designation from whoever has the G10. I would get my variable information, lot, data manufacturer, serial number from my ERP team. I'd get my country of origin from purchasing, and I would get everything else. My manufacturing address, instructions, warnings, CE mark if needed, authorized European representative, basically all the symbols that aren't dictated by development and any country-specific requirements, I'd get those from regulatory affairs. The vast majority of the data would come from development and RA. I would also make regulatory affairs the owner of labeling. RA wouldn't be the one to make the labels. They wouldn't need to collect the data, but they would be the final arbiter of all label content. That document with the list of labeling content elements we just talked about a few minutes ago, pair these responsibilities with those label elements. Regulatory affairs should own this document. In my experience, we restricted all label requests, new labels or label revisions to regulatory. This kept marketing or quality or anyone else from going directly to labeling. This policy lent itself to really strong communication channels, prevented a lot of unnecessary work and churn, and it kept the marketing guys out of our work area. But since I'm not necessarily in charge, I would just make sure that I was getting the elements from whomever owned the element. If you know what content you're looking for and you know where it's supposed to come from, now you want to take a look at your procedures for developing and printing your labels. For standard procedures, we need to have one procedure for developing labels and another one for issuing labels. In production, issuing labels in production, as these procedures live in different worlds. For creating, revising, and approving labels, look to see if you have a simple, straightforward label development process that from a high level looks like this. receive a label request form, identify the label size, format the label, possibly per a style guide, confirm the label prints on production printers, send the label out for approval, enable the label in the label system once the label is approved. Since we're not just reporting on the bare facts of the label process and we're looking at it as a system, it's now obvious that whatever process you have and whatever process it is that you're assessing, it is informed by the first two pillars of a solid labeling process: content identification and roles and responsibility. If these first two elements of your assessment don't support an optimized process, it won't take too long to recognize that your current development process is much more complicated than it has to be. A couple of years ago, we engaged with a client that came to us for an assessment. They had a brand new global director of packaging. They just joined the company, and had inherited a devastatingly complicated labeling process. The first thing she did was to conduct a process mapping of how they developed their labels. She sent over the flow chart of a label process. Then she sent over another flow chart, and then another. So I called her and I asked her, how many different label development processes do you have? And she said, I've found 9 so far, but I know there's more out there. She was discovering that her company's label development process was not only overly complicated, but without anyone realizing it, it had replicated itself, and every different type of label had its own unique development process. They hadn't identified required label elements. They didn't have roles and responsibilities defined. Of course, each of the label developments was a disaster. Their first line in each one was essentially, assess the chaos. It was a mess. When we were halfway through our assessment, she asked me, shouldn't labeling be simple? And if there's only one thought you take from this webinar, take this one. Labeling should be simple. If you know what must go on your label and you know who has that content, your label process should collect the data, format the label, and have it approved by the appropriate people. The person designing the label should provide absolutely no label content. This person should be familiar with the system and tools needed to design a label. They should know their way around a change control system, and they should never start to create or revise a label until a label request form is completed. This label request form can be paired with your creating, revising, and approving labels work instruction or RA's required label elements, and have the form filled out by the people identified as responsible for the information. The label designer gets this form, then checks with the packaging engineer to find out the size of the label that's going to be used on the product, and then formats the label per a style guide. Gets it all done, prints it out on an agreed upon printer that confirms that it is production ready, and sends the label out for approval in whatever workflow you're using. Once the label is approved, the label designer can approve the label in the labeling system, and then operations is the owner of the label. Your issuance of labeling work instruction should work for all your production labeling. Use 21 CFR 820.120 for your outline on how to assess this procedure. Make sure you have receiving inspection for all your incoming labels. You have storage for labels arranged to prevent mix-up when pulling labels to print, and start every labeling event with a line clearance. Once printed, make sure your labels are legible and verify that they are correct. I always check this part of the procedure against the verbiage in 21 CFR 82120B. And in case there's someone on this webinar that isn't a total compliance wonk, 21 CFR 820 is the Quality System Regulations, or QSR, and Section 120 has to do with labels and labeling. The wording for label verification reads, examine the label for accuracy, including, where appropriate, the correct unique device identifier, UDI, or universal product code, expiration date, control number, storage conditions, handling instructions, and any additional processing instructions. The release, including the date and signature of the individuals performing the examination, shall be documented in the device history record. The other things you should include in your DHR is the lot number of the label stock you use on that lot, as well as the results of your label reconciliation. The last aspect of your production labeling when you're doing your assessment is that you have to account for the UDI barcode legibility. And in order to show the UDI barcode is legible, you'll have to have a validated barcode grader, and you will have to achieve a passing grade on your barcodes throughout the day. To accomplish this, most companies will grade the first barcode of the shift for each printer and record this to use as objective evidence that the barcodes are printing legibly without having to grade each lot. Look for any other printing of labels beyond your own manufacturing floor. You may have a second or third manufacturing site, you may have a contract manufacturer printing, or you may have labels being printed in your distribution center. They should all have the same basic procedure. In a nutshell, when it comes to your labeling procedures, they should be simple. The actual procedure for labeling designer may be complex due to stepping through label system requirements with screenshots, formatting tools, and data loading. But when you're looking at your procedure for approving, revising, for creating, revising, and approving labels, look for multiple approval steps as they indicate where you can take out some inefficiencies from the process. Now that we've stepped through the standard processes and the process from wanting a label to printing a label, the last thing we're going to assess is your labeling system. Labeling systems run the gamut from multi-million-dollar global systems to programs downloaded off the internet. Everyone should have a validated labeling process, and the best way to do this is with a validated labeling system. Back to 21 CFR 820, Quality System Regulations, Part 70I, Automated Processes, says, when computers or automated data processing systems are used as part of production or the quality system, the manufacturer shall validate computer software for its intended use according to established protocol. All software changes shall be validated before approval and issuance. This validation starts with the user requirement specification, and that user requirement specification should be informed by a risk assessment with appropriate hazard mitigation. This seems kind of heavy, and so we'll leave those details to a future webinar currently scheduled for 2 weeks from now on how to choose a global labeling system. Let's just say that you have a good system if the validated status eases the process of excessive verifications and approvals. Your contract manufacturers and offsite locations can log onto your system and print labels designed and approved by you, the design control holder. You can use it instead of document control to hold the latest approved version of your label, thereby not needing a drawing or paper copy specification of each one of your labels. This is tremendously efficient. With a validated workflow inside your label system, you can optimize the change control process by balancing how much of the approval is done in the labeling system and how much is done in the change control system. Some systems connect with change control systems, meaning that you can do all the changes in the labeling system and the change control system will still be aware and have access to details of the change. With Adobe plugins, the labeling system can house all of your labeling, your product labels, your InDesign files for your IFUs, and your Adobe Illustrator files for your carton graphics. With a data management-based label system, your system can hold multiple labels for the same product, and you can control which labels prints based on the label type and printer configuration. This not only eliminates the need to control label content through discretely identified label ID numbers on bills of material, but it also eliminates the manual assignment of those labels by controlling those labels with the system. Country-specific labeling is now as easy as labeling on your manufacturing floor. Again, we'll be discussing global enterprise labeling systems in more detail in a couple of weeks. I hope you can join us. Getting a global labeling system is really one of the best things a med device company can do for itself. In conclusion, as you make your assessment of your labeling process and collect the pain points as you interview the various stakeholders, you'll be able to address those pain points as they relate to one of the 4 pillars. Group your pain points into these 4 categories: content identification, roles and responsibility, standard procedures, and label system. This order also lines up with ease and cost of making the necessary changes to your labeling process. It doesn't take much time or resources to identify content. You just need to define what you're trying to accomplish and then gather the requirements to meet that goal. Roles and responsibilities can require a lot of negotiation to reach agreement on giving up some ownership, taking on some ownership, but this won't cost you too much. Getting to standard procedures involves a multitude of stakeholders, and it's going to take some time to reach consensus. The effort to revise procedures will consume resources, so this step typically takes some time and effort. And then lastly, the global labeling system is going to be both transformative to your business as well as costly to purchase and costly to deploy. Unless you already have a global labeling system, this is ultimately the biggest impact you can make to your labeling process. Follow these steps and you can start making improvements to your process in an order that starts off with few resources and little costs and results in the elimination of pain points. As you gain momentum and get to standardized procedures, the only pain points remaining will be those issues that can only be resolved with a global labeling system. A review of your assessment can be used to support the need to start looking at global labeling systems as well as next year's budget. Anything you can do to make labeling simple will be an improvement to your process. That is the end of my webinar.
Chris Heckert, thank you so much for such an excellent presentation and walking us through labeling process assessments. It was awesome and hilarious at times, so thank you for keeping us on our toes. Before we get into our Q&A, I wanted to take a quick moment to mention that Network Partners has 2 more webinars in our Labeling Brunch and Learn series. The first is how to expertly choose a global labeling system. And then the next one is what a global labeling system implementation really looks like. And these webinars are now open for registration on the Network Partners site under resources and then events. So Chris, so far you have one comment question. I'm going to read it and then you can decide obviously how to answer. Would love to see example or format for user-friendly of label request form, or any tips how to make an effective one?
Okay, they are wildly different based on the product that you're making. For a standard disposable device, we promote an Excel file that floats around. It's got protected areas on it. We identify the content. We identify the people who are responsible for that content. And that Excel file goes from department to department to be filled out by the people responsible. That's a little complicated. It's obviously it's more complicated than I'm making it sound, because sometimes you want to put a lot of products on your label request form, a lot of item numbers, and they're all a little different. But because they share so many characteristics, it's still easy to fill out that way. It just gets a little complicated. When we do the paper versions of the label request forms, we line it up the same way, where we group the elements that we're looking for are grouped per department that's responsible for them. And if they're necessary, they check the yes box required, and then they put what the element should be it a symbol or a product description or something like that. And when it's required conditionally, they mark it off as NA, and they sign off on all this. So if you have a non-sterile part and one of the conditional required elements would be a sterile symbol, that would be marked NA, signed off, dated, and that label request form becomes your source data, and it becomes what you check the label against. But you knew that part. And I'm sorry. Anyone, you're welcome to contact myself, Chris Bonifield. Our contact information is up on the slide right now. If you have a question like this, I can show you samples of what we offer our clients to maybe get you started.
All right, great. Thank you, Chris. The next one is, where is the final label request form stored?
That label request form comes to the labeling department and is attached to the change notice. So all the label request forms are attached to the change notice with the labels as they go through the approval process, and that's where we store that is where we suggest that you store your label request form, because it's going to be the signed official copy of your source data.
Very good. We have a packaging engineering student on as well, and they are curious if, aside from verifying the dimensions of the label, are there any other responsibilities that packaging engineers have regarding labeling?
That's a great question because there are. I didn't bring it up in this process as it's more towards labeling people, but the packaging engineer will have to conduct a design verification for the label. The label will have to remain legible and affixed to the package through the rigors of distribution and storage. So a packaging engineer, the protocol might look like, let's print 100 labels, put them on our packages. Actually, when you're doing your distribution testing, make sure you have a printed label on there. Part of the acceptance criteria at the end of your distribution test will be inspect the labels to make sure they're still affixed to the package and make sure they're still legible. And when you check that off, you've covered half your design verification. The other half of your design verification comes from your stability study, where you're putting the label on a part that is going through accelerated aging, and you'll do the same thing. It's got to stay affixed and legible to the product. You only have to do that when for labels that share the adhesive and face stock and the printing method. You only need to do it to one of those. But as soon as you have a different adhesive and a different face stock, you'll need to run that same verification process on those same tests.
Great, thank you. Who is the typical requester? Is it regulatory affairs?
Well, that's going to vary by company. In a perfect world, I think, and I've experienced this, when regulatory is the only people that can request a label, anyone that wants to make a label change has got to go to regulatory, and they wipe off a lot of the nonsense that people want to put on labels. So if you were to route all label requests through regulatory, that is your cleanest method of requesting labels, in my opinion.
All right. One more question. Sorry about that. A few more. How is legibility measured in design verification? How can we make the assessment less subjective?
That is also a great question, one that I spent about 12 months working on it my last time I worked at a med device supplier. The government tells you that the person printing the label is capable of assessing the legibility of that label. And all they have to do is attest that it is legible. Legibility is not being able to read the label. It's just making sure that it's printed clearly. So when you write your issuance of labeling procedures or you're checking for them, you just need to have someone sign off. It's very subjective. But if they believe that the printing is, if the label that prints in production matches the label specification and it's clear, the FDA has said that any trained label operator is capable of making that assessment.
Okay. Are the requests bucketed on the request forms by product line, by changes needed? Each individual label doesn't need its own request form, correct?
That is correct. That is correct. When you're coming out with a line extension or you're coming out with a whole line, you can put all of those requests on a single form. A lot of those labels will have the exact same content. The only thing that might change might be the size. So you can bundle those requests onto a single form.
And then the last one so far, sorry. I'm gonna stop saying that it's the last question because as soon as I do another question comes in, so I'll just start being patient. Can you elaborate a little on the requirements for barcode verification?
Yes, this is a fascinating subject for probably everyone on the call. Barcodes, there are ISO standards for barcode grading, and I'm going to guess this is where that's going as opposed to label barcode content. ISO 15, 415, 416, and 417 all lay out the requirements to grade a barcode, different kinds of barcodes, data matrix barcodes, linear barcodes, and they've got one specifically for the 128 barcode. When you set your acceptance criteria internally. Do yourself a favor and make sure you don't set your grade requirement too high. A grade, if your barcode grades out as a C, it means it's eminently scannable, but it might not get scanned on the first pass. If you're a med device, the end use of your barcode will allow people to hit it twice with a barcode reader in order to get that information. So you don't need a really high grade. If you're a pharmaceutical company and you're using your barcodes on your line and you're running 100 packages past a scanner a minute, and you're going to kick off anywhere the barcode doesn't read, you might need a slightly higher grade. But look at ISO 15415, ISO 15416, and ISO 417. They'll give you how barcodes are graded, what the 5 different things they're looking at are, and I hope that answers your question.
All right. What is your opinion of using the label over carton folding as a form of tamper evidency?
I think it's great. My opinion is if you need to have tamper evident, if you need tamper evidency on cartons, use the label to do one end of the carton, and then a smaller label, tamper evident label on the other end. I think it's a great idea.
Okay, so I believe that was the last question. I'll give that a few more seconds as we're wrapping up. So thank you to everyone for your participation today during this Brunch and Learn, and to our speaker, Chris Heckert. If you have any labeling questions or you need labeling help, you can always reach out to a Network Partners team member, and we can ensure that the question gets to the appropriate contact. Again, you'll receive this recorded presentation and a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. Be sure to stay in the loop and follow Network Partners on LinkedIn to access our updates and future free webinars. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great rest of your Thursday.